Welcome to this introduction to the European Commission. The European Commission is one of the original institutions of the European coal and steel community. It has evolved in the course of time, but many of its core tasks have remained relatively stable. The European Commission is one of the key EU institutions in many policy-making processes, and it can be considered the EU's executive in many, but not all policy areas. In the majority of cases, the European Commission initiates the legislative process. In the ordinary legislative procedure, which today is the commonly used procedure to make EU laws, it has the prerogative to draft and submit legislative proposals to the Council of Ministers and the European Parliament. This is called the right of initiative. The European Commission's role is less pronounced and formalized in areas such as foreign and security policy. In this brief introduction, I will first take you through the European Commission's historical evolution, then discuss the different roles that the Commission fulfills. As a third part, I will outline how the College of Commissioners is appointed, and then briefly address the Commission's internal organization. In the institutional design of the 1952 European Coal and Steel Community, the European Commission was called the High Authority, and it was based in Luxembourg. It had 9 members, 2 commissioners from the big member states and 1 commissioner for each of the small member states. This rule remained in place until the Nice Treaty, which entered into force in 2003. Since then, every member state sends 1 commissioner. When the Treaty of Rome entered into force in 1958, it established a separate commission for the European Economic Community and Euratom, which was based in Brussels. The 1965 merger treaty joined these 2 institutions and established the Commission of the European Communities, with its main seat in Brussels and a few services in Luxembourg. The 1992 Maastricht Treaty linked then the appointment of commissioners to the electoral cycle of the European Parliament. Previously, the member states appointed commissioners for 4-year terms. Since the European elections of 1994, the term of office of the President of the European Commission and of all commissioners has been 5 years, aligned with the term of office of the members of European Parliament. The Commission takes up office roughly 6 months after the European elections. The Maastricht Treaty also introduced the obligation to consult the European Parliament on the candidate for the Commission President, and it introduced the obligation of a vote of confidence by the European Parliament for the entire College of Commissioners. These 2 changes of the EU institutional architecture was a first step to link the appointment of the European Commission to the European elections. The Amsterdam Treaty, which entered into force in 1999, enshrined the right of the European Parliament to confirm the designated Commission President, instead of merely being consulted. The Lisbon Treaty, which entered into force in 2009, postulates that when choosing the candidate for the President of the European Commission, the European Council should take into account the outcome of the European elections. It also introduced the provision that the High Representative of the Union for Foreign Affairs and Security Policy, a position that has traits of an EU foreign minister, be one of the vice presidents of the European Commission, trying to reinforce the link between the EU's foreign and security policy and its internal policies. The European Commission is an independent institution representing the general interest of the European Union. Commissioners shall not take instructions from a European member state. When the government of a member state changes during the term of office of a College of Commissioners, the respective country's commissioner does not change. The European Commission fulfills a number of important tasks in the EU institutional architecture. This includes the initiation and proposing of laws and policy, the implementation of EU laws through delegated rulemaking processes, the execution of the EU budget, the management of EU programs, the supervision and enforcement of member state transposition of EU laws, and the external representation of the EU in a number of policy areas. One of the European Commission's core activities and prerogative is its right of initiative, which means that in the ordinary legislative procedure and in a number of other procedures, the European Commission is the only institution that has the right to propose a new law. The other institutions, most prominently the Council of Ministers and the European Parliament, play a crucial role in amending and adopting the Commission proposal. But without a legislative proposal from the Commission, they cannot become active and they cannot adopt a law. The Commission also initiates policies other than laws, for example by adopting so-called communications, which can set out frameworks for policy priorities and activities, or green papers, which strive to stimulate discussion on a given European topic, or white papers, which outline proposals for EU action in a specific area. The European Commission also has delegated rulemaking powers. This means that it plays a central role in the adoption of so-called delegated and implementing acts. These acts fill in details and update existing laws in cases in which that particular law foresees the further specification of provisions by means of delegated or implementing acts. The European Commission can adopt non-legislative acts of general application to supplement or amend certain non-essential elements of legislative acts. This would then be a delegated act. Yet, especially in the case of delegated acts, the Council of Ministers and the European Parliament retain some influence by being able to object to a Commission proposal, but they're not able to amend it. Routine implementation of laws are done through implementing acts, in which expert committees of national experts are involved, and in some cases, the European Parliament and the Council have a right of scrutiny. Another executive role of the European Commission is the execution of the EU budget in areas such as the common agricultural policy and EU cohesion funds. Yet another task is the managing of EU programs. One other key task of the European Commission is overseeing member state implementation of EU laws. When the Commission notices that a member state has not or not correctly transposed an EU law, it will first of all engage in informal discussions to solve the problem. If this fails, it has three tools of increasing severity. The first is issuing a letter of formal notice. The second is a reasoned opinion. And the third and most severe tool is bringing the case before the Court of Justice of the European Union. Most problems, though, are solved at the stage of the formal notice, which generally gives member states 2 months to address the issue. Another core task of the European Commission is the external representation of the EU in areas other than the common foreign and security policy. For example, in trade negotiations, the European Commission negotiates on behalf of the EU with other external trading partners. When using the word European Commission, people can actually refer to two things. Some refer to the entire bureaucracy of roughly 33,000 members of staff. Some others refer to the so-called College of Commissioners, which comprises the Commission President, the Vice Presidents, and the regular Commissioners. The number of members of the College of Commissioners is equal to the number of EU member states. The College of Commissioners is composed of one president, one high representative of the Union for Foreign and Security Policy, and a number of other commissioners, some of which are vice presidents. The regular commissioners have a specific policy portfolio for which they are responsible. Regardless of this distribution of different policy areas, the College of Commissioners in its entirety jointly takes decisions, and each commissioner, irrespective of his or her initial or personal position, must defend the joint commission position once it has been decided upon. The President of the European Commission convenes and chairs the meetings of the College of Commissioners. He or she sets guidelines for the work of the Commission and its internal organization, and he or she distributes policy portfolios to the different commissioners. The President of the European Commission also represents the European Commission towards other EU institutions, at meetings with member state governments, and with external governments. Commission President Jean-Claude Juncker introduced a number of novelties in the internal organization of the Commission. He created the position of the so-called First Vice President as his right hand, which is a position that is not mentioned in the EU treaties. President Juncker also designated vice presidents who are in charge of coordinating groups of commissioners with interconnected portfolios in so-called project teams. This is to generate more policy coherence and to encourage dynamic interaction amongst commissioners and their policy areas. Have a look at the organization chart of the current College of Commissioners. What do you think about its structure? We will discuss its advantages, disadvantages, and implications in class. The European Commissioners are appointed for 5-year terms that can be renewed if they are proposed again by the member states. The European Council first proposes a candidate for the position of the Commission President. This requires a qualified majority according to the treaty. But in reality, heads of state and government strive to find consensus. The European Parliament then elects the Commission President, for which it requires a majority of its component members. The Lisbon Treaty introduced the requirement that the European Council takes the outcome of the European elections into account when selecting the candidate for the Commission President. Informally, this has led to a process in which the large European political parties select their so-called Spitzenkandidat, which means their candidate for the position of the Commission President in case they become the largest political group in the European Parliament. This is one example of how the European Parliament and the European political parties have created a procedure and institutionalized it that is not found in the treaties. This is similar to the hearings of the candidates for the positions of the regular commissioners. Try to find out who the different Spitzenkandidaten were in the most recent European elections. Which position do they hold now? After the election of the Commission President, each member state, in consultation with the newly elected President, proposes a candidate for the position of a commissioner. The member state from where the Commission President comes does of course not propose an additional candidate. The Council of Ministers adopts the list of commissioners designated. The Commission President, the High Representative, and all commissioners jointly are subject to a vote by the European Parliament, which is required to give its consent. Here again, an informal procedure has been institutionalized, which is the one of hearings of each and every commissioner designate for the specific portfolio for which the newly elected president envisages the respective candidate. It has happened a number of times that the European Parliament was not convinced by a candidate's qualification and integrity, and for this reason threatened to withhold its approval of the entire College of Commissioners. After discussions and negotiations, some candidates were replaced by new candidates. Have a look at the most recent commissioner-designate hearings and identify the ones which were controversial. What was the European Parliament's criticism? Do you find it justified? We'll discuss in class. As a final step of the procedure, the entire College of Commissioners, including President, the High Representative, and all commissioners, is appointed by the European Council by qualified majority. In cases of severe misconduct, the Commission President can request members of the Commission to resign. In addition, the European Parliament can vote on a motion of censure of the Commission, which requires a 2/3 majority of the votes cast, representing a majority of all members of the European Parliament. It can, however, dismiss only the entire College of Commissioners, not individual commissioners. Moreover, the Court of Justice can compulsorily retire commissioners. The European Commission is organized in so-called Directorates General, which have some similarities to national ministries, but also some differences, since they are not always one-on-one attributed to individual commissioners. And there's not always a perfect match between commissioner portfolios and a Directorate General's policy area. As you could see, the European Commission plays an important role in the EU institutional architecture as an institution that represents the general interest of the European Union and drives forward policy development in numerous policy areas. I hope this introduction made you curious to find out more about this intriguing institution.